For humans, 400 pounds is considered significantly overweight, but in the vast ocean, it pales in comparison to the size and power of sharks. Excess weight can limit mobility, leaving even the strongest swimmers vulnerable. Such was the case for a man seeking peace in the water. Unfortunately, his slowed movements drew the attention of a nearby shark. Perceiving its territory disturbed, the predator struck, unmoved by the helpless cries of the man's family watching in horror. Join us as we recount the heart-wrenching events that followed. The sun hung high in the cloudless sky, casting its golden rays over the tranquil beach where Rob and his family had arrived for a much-needed vacation. The coast of Mexico, renowned for its pristine sands and aquamarine waters, was the perfect escape for the O'Briens, a family of 4. Rob, towering at 6 feet 4 inches and tipping the scale at 400 pounds, had spent the past several months immersed in his work, neglecting his health and yearning for a break. His wife, Janet, and their 2 children, Emma and Jack, were thrilled to enjoy a tropical retreat together finally. The ocean called to them, its rhythmic waves lapping against the shore, a soothing melody that promised serenity. As the family set up their spot on the beach, unrolling towels, placing sunscreen on exposed skin, and arranging snacks, Rob stood at the water's edge. The inviting expanse of the ocean beckoned to him, its surface sparkling under the midday sun. Reclining on her towel, Janet glanced up from her book, watching him with an amused smile. Rob had always loved the water. He had talked excitedly about going for a swim since they'd arrived. With his imposing stature and pleasant demeanor, it was easy to forget that beneath his size and good-natured humor, Rob harbored insecurities about his weight, which often kept him from enjoying simple pleasures. But today was different. He felt free. With a deep breath, Rob took his first step into the cool water, its embrace sending a shiver of excitement up his spine. His children, building sandcastles nearby, cheered as he waded farther and farther from the shore. The waves broke gently around him, their force mild as he floated easily. From where Janet sat, Rob looked peaceful, his large frame gently bobbing on the water's surface. She returned to her book, content that her family was enjoying themselves, blissfully unaware of the danger lurking below. Beneath the waves, the ocean teemed with life. Fish darted between coral formations, seaweed swayed in the currents, and unbeknownst to the swimmers, a massive presence cut through the depths in silence. A great white shark, measuring over 15 feet long, was moving through the area, its powerful body gliding effortlessly. It had been hunting for hours, its predatory instincts guiding it as it scouted for prey. Sharks are often misunderstood creatures, more curious than aggressive. But in the right circumstances, hunger and opportunity intertwine in a deadly dance. Today, Rob was in the wrong place at the wrong time. As Rob floated, unaware of the looming danger, the shark detected subtle vibrations in the water. Its black, soulless eyes honed in on the oversized silhouette drifting above. To the predator, Rob appeared vulnerable, a massive target, his shadow casting an inviting signal. With each second, the shark closed the distance between them, moving with terrifying precision. There was no warning, no chance to sense the terror approaching. Rob continued to float, feeling the sun's warmth on his face, utterly disconnected from the deadly force below. The attack came without a sound. One moment, Rob was at peace, his limbs outstretched in the salty water. The next, a crushing, unimaginable pain enveloped him. The shark struck with the force of a freight train, its jaws clamping down with over 4,000 pounds of pressure, teeth as sharp as knives puncturing flesh and bone. Rob was yanked violently beneath the surface in a whirlpool of bubbles and blood. His body, helpless against the strength of the predator, thrashed in panic, his lungs burning as he fought to rise to the surface. On shore, Janet lifted her eyes from her book just as a commotion began. She saw the disturbance in the water. A sudden splash followed by a dark shape moving quickly. At first, her brain couldn't process what was happening. Her eyes scanned the area where Rob had been floating, but he was gone. Panic began to seep into her chest as her heart quickened. Once a clear turquoise, the water slowly turned a deep, murky red. Emma and Jack, still busy with their sandcastles, noticed the change in their mother's expression, but neither could understand the horror dawning in her wide eyes. Janet leaped to her feet, her heart now pounding in her ears. She screamed her husband's name while rushing to the water's edge. Other beachgoers began to take notice of the scene, and lifeguards sprang into action, their whistles shrill as they ran toward the water with rescue boards. But the sea had already claimed its victim. Under the waves, Rob struggled in vain. His vision blurred as the salt water stung his eyes, the dark outline of the shark barely discernible as it dragged him deeper into the ocean's abyss. His formidable strength on land was useless here. The shark's jaws released momentarily before it struck again, pulling Rob deeper into the water than he had ever imagined. The world around him darkened, the sun above a distant, unreachable memory. By the time lifeguards reached the blood-streaked water, it was too late. They dived beneath the surface, searching for any sign of Rob, but found only torn clothing and water-stained red. Surfacing, they exchanged grim looks, the reality sinking in for those watching from shore. Janet collapsed onto the sand, her cries piercing the air as she realized the tragedy. Emma and Jack's children clung to her, too young to fully understand but frightened by what they sensed. The once lively beach fell silent. Strangers stood in shock, some shielding their children's eyes, others whispering prayers. In the days that followed, headlines reported a rare and tragic shark attack. But for the O'Brien family, the loss was immeasurable. Rob, a devoted husband and father, was gone, taken in a brutal moment that would replay in their minds forever. What had started as a carefree vacation had become a nightmare. Janet would revisit that beach in her memories, haunted by the sight of the clear water turning red and the helplessness of watching her husband disappear. No words could erase the horror of that day, and no comfort could heal the wound left behind. The pain was a scar they would carry forever. It became a cautionary tale for the world, a reminder of the ocean's dangers. But for Janet, Emma, and Jack, it was the day they lost Rob, a man who had wanted to enjoy the sea, only to be claimed by its most feared predator. The void he left could never be filled. The evening had been perfect. Beth and John have always loved beaches. California beaches aren't different. They were truly enjoying the evening with the sand between their toes, the rhythmic push and pull of the waves, and the expansive sky. That evening, everything was serene. The sun hung low, casting warm hues of orange and pink over the water's surface. The breeze was soft, just enough to rustle their hair and carry the salty scent of the ocean through the air. Their usual routine was to take sunset walks after work, a shared moment of quiet that both cherished deeply. As they strolled along the shore, hand in hand, they talked about their future, their upcoming wedding, their plans to move into a new home, and the adventures they'd experience together. There was no sense of urgency in their steps, no awareness that the peace they felt would soon unravel into unimaginable terror. Beth and John had always felt a connection to the sea. Sometimes, they would wade into the shallow surf, laughing and playing like children. That night, with the water lapping at their ankles and the fading light casting a golden sheen across the surface, the idea of stepping in felt natural. Beth led the way, splashing playfully, and John followed, his laughter blending with the gentle crash of the waves. They stood just a few feet from the shore, the water barely reaching their knees. It was cool but comfortable, a perfect way to wind down the day. For a moment, everything seemed perfect, the perfection that feels almost too good to last. And then, in an instant, the atmosphere shifted. John's laughter broke into a short, confused gasp. His body jerked violently to one side, and for a moment, Beth thought he had tripped or perhaps stumbled on a sharp rock beneath the water, not knowing it was something more sinister. She didn't even have time to call out before the second tug, more forceful and deliberate. John was yanked sideways, his body moving not of his own accord but from an unseen force beneath the water. A wave surged up, splashing against Beth's waist, and she stumbled back, blinking in disbelief as John let out a choked cry. What had felt like playful splashing now morphed into frantic, chaotic thrashing. Beth's mind struggled to grasp the reality of what was happening. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw the dark shadow of a bull shark beneath the surface, moving with terrifying speed and purpose. John was being dragged away from her. His body was pulled toward deeper water, his arms flailing as he tried to fight back against whatever had gripped him. For a split second, Beth froze, her mind rejecting the horror unfolding before her. But then instinct kicked in. She screamed, a raw, desperate sound that tore through the stillness of the evening. She called his name over and over, her voice hoarse and panicked, as if the sheer force of her cries could somehow pull him back to her. Her feet moved clumsily through the surf as she tried to follow him, trying to reach him. But the water deepened rapidly, and she felt herself struggling to keep balance against the pull of the waves. The shark darted beneath the surface again, faster than before, and John's head dipped beneath the water. His arms shot up, his fingers spread wide as if reaching for her. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, he was gone. The world seemed to stop at that moment. Once rhythmic and predictable, the waves felt violent and uncaring as they lapped against her legs. Beth stood there, chest heaving, her mind unable to reconcile the quiet moments they had shared just minutes before with the horror of the present. Her eyes were fixed on where John had disappeared, the water now tinged with a dark, spreading stain. The stark and sickening contrast looked unreal, the red blossoming in the otherwise calm sea. Somewhere in the distance, Beth became vaguely aware of the sounds of people, voices, footsteps on the sand, but they seemed distant, as if they belonged to another world. She barely registered the figures rushing toward her, their faces tight with concern and confusion. She couldn't move, speak, or do anything but stand there, staring at the water, waiting for John to resurface. Her mind clung to the faint, irrational hope that he would break through the surface any second, gasping for air, and they would laugh about how close they had come to disaster. But the minutes dragged on, and John didn't return. The rescuers had arrived, their bright vests a jarring contrast to the fading light of the sunset. They waded into the water with purpose, scanning the surface and shouting instructions to one another. A small crowd had gathered along the shore, murmuring in low voices, their expressions a mix of shock and pity. But Beth remained detached from it all, her body rooted to the spot, her mind still refusing to accept what her eyes had seen. The search continued as the evening stretched into twilight. The once golden sky had darkened, and the almost black sea offered no clues or trace of John. Eventually, one of the rescuers approached Beth, his face solemn, his words quiet but definitive. The search would continue, but the chances of finding John alive were slim. The reality hit her like a wave crashing down, hard and unforgiving. He was gone. She didn't scream anymore. She couldn't. Her throat was raw, her chest tight with grief and disbelief. She stood there, staring at the dark water, her feet sinking into the wet sand as the tide came in. The blood-stained water had long since dispersed, carried away by the ocean currents, but the memory of it remained burned into her mind, a grotesque reminder of how quickly life could change. As the night deepened and the crowd thinned, Beth remained on the beach, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She didn't know how long she stood there, her mind numb with shock, her body trembling with cold and fear. All she could think about was how, in the blink of an eye, her world had been ripped apart, leaving her alone on the shore, staring into the dark abyss where her fiancé had once been. The sun blazed in the sky, heating the white hull of the fishing boat as it gently rocked on the waves. Mark and his teenage son, Jake, were on their annual fishing trip off the Florida coast. The air was salty, and the cries of seagulls were the only sounds aside from the boat's quiet engine. They had looked forward to this day, excited to cast lines into the deep blue and enjoy time together, far from daily concerns. Mark, a lifelong fisherman, cherished this tradition with Jake. Their yearly trips provided a rare chance for father and son to bond over the thrill of a big catch. Today felt perfect. Mark had just hooked something heavy, and the line strained as he fought the unseen fish beneath the water. He smiled at Jake, sharing the excitement. Mark braced himself against the deck, muscles straining as the powerful fish thrashed below. The rod bent, the reel clicked, and the water churned behind the boat. Mark's experience showed in his steady grip and calculated movements, but neither he nor Jake noticed the ominous shadow appearing beneath the waves. The sea was a living thing, teeming with life, but it could also be treacherous, hiding its dangers in its unfathomable depths. A massive tiger shark, sleek and ancient, glided through the water just below the boat, its black eyes devoid of emotion, locked onto the struggling father and son. The vibrations in the water had drawn it, the frantic movements of the fish on Mark's line and the thrumming pulse of their boat. This predator was on the hunt, over 12 feet long and weighing over 1,000 pounds. As Mark focused entirely on his catch, the shark circled silently, coming closer with each pass. It was patient and cunning, its hunger driving it into a deadly state of focus. The water near the surface bubbled slightly as the creature grew bolder. Still, neither Mark nor Jake knew their lives would be irrevocably changed. In one violent surge, the shark attacked. It came from the depths like a nightmare, its mouth agape, rows of serrated teeth glinting as it burst from beneath the boat. The impact force sent the small fishing vessel reeling to one side, knocking Mark and Jake off balance. There was no time to react, no moment of clarity before the chaos. Both father and son tumbled into the water, their cries swallowed by the ocean. Mark hit the water hard, the cold shock of it knocking the air from his lungs. For a moment he was disoriented, submerged in the blue-green depths. Instinctively he kicked upward, breaking the surface with a gasp, only to hear Jake's frantic splashing nearby. His paternal instincts kicked in immediately, and he swam toward his son, his only thought to keep Jake safe. Mark called Jake, reaching for his son as the boy flailed in the water, panic written across his face. He managed to grab Jake by the arm, pulling him toward the boat. But even as he struggled to keep them both afloat, a dark shape loomed beneath them, circling like a death sentence. Mark saw the shark for the first time then, its massive, silent form gliding just below the surface. Fear gripped him, but he fought to keep calm. There was no time for fear. With a final burst of strength, he shoved Jake toward the boat. Jake reached for the boat's edge, clawing at it with desperate hands, his body slick with seawater. But as he heaved himself over the side, Mark felt something unimaginable, an impact so violent it nearly tore him in half. The shark had struck. Its powerful jaws clamped down on Mark's leg, the force of its bite crushing bone and ripping through muscle. The pain was immediate and excruciating, a white-hot agony that stole his breath. Mark screamed, his voice lost in the crashing waves. Blood billowed around him, darkening the water in an expanding cloud. The shark pulled, dragging him beneath the surface in an instant. He struggled, every survival instinct kicking in, thrashing with his free leg, pounding at the shark's head with his fists. But the beast was relentless. Its jaws locked tighter, yanking Mark deeper into the ocean with a brutal twisting motion. Above, Jake had just made it onto the boat, his body shaking with terror. He looked back into the water, searching for his father. Instead, he saw a scene of horror, the sea stained red, churning as the shark pulled Mark under. His father's outstretched hand reached toward the surface for only a second before being swallowed by the depths. The water boiled with movement, and then silence. Jake collapsed onto the deck, sobbing, gasping for air, his hands shaking uncontrollably. His mind raced, unable to process the nightmare that had unfolded before his eyes. The shark was gone, leaving nothing but the blood-stained water and the heavy stillness that followed such violence. For a long moment, Jake lay there, his breath coming in ragged gasps, trying to grasp what had just happened. The boat rocked gently as if mocking the carnage that had just occurred. The sun shone brightly and the sky was clear, but everything had changed. What was meant to be a day of bonding, of simple joy and connection, had become the worst day of Jake's life. He was alone. His father was gone, taken in the blink of an eye by the merciless predator of the deep. The realization crashed over Jake like a wave, and he screamed, a raw, guttural sound that seemed to shake the air around him. Hours later, when the Coast Guard finally found Jake, he was curled up on the deck, his face pale and his body trembling. The water had long since calmed, and the boat drifted in the fading light. But Jake's mind would forever be trapped in that moment, watching his father disappear beneath the waves, helpless against nature's brutality. The waters of the Maldives shimmered with sunlight, casting vibrant pink, orange, and purple hues over the coral. Laura floated peacefully, watching colorful fish dart among the reefs. Her husband Michael swam ahead, guiding their two children, Sam and Lily, as they marveled at the marine life. It was a perfect family moment, their first vacation in years. The ocean always brought Laura peace. The gentle lapping of the waves calmed her, washing away the stress of daily life. Today was no exception. They had ventured far from shore, but the shallow waters felt safe and the beauty of the coral reef below kept any thoughts of danger at bay. As Sam and Lily pointed excitedly at a school of clownfish, Laura smiled, savoring the serenity. She relaxed momentarily, feeling weightless in the ocean's gentle sway. But then a shadow flickered in her peripheral vision. Her heartbeat quickened, but she dismissed it, thinking her mind was playing tricks. A sudden violent force struck her, shattering the calm. The water churned around her as she struggled to regain balance. Then she saw it, a reef shark, its rough skin brushing against her as it clamped onto her arm with terrifying force. The pain was instant and blinding, an electric jolt that surged through her body, freezing her in place. The shark's teeth tore into her flesh with the precision of a predator evolved for this very act, its powerful jaws clamping down like a vice. She could feel her bones shift, the sickening crunch as the shark's bite grew tighter. Her arm, once weightless in the water, now felt like it was on fire, and with each thrash of the shark, the agony multiplied. She tried to scream, but no sound came. Her snorkel mask filled with salt water as her face dipped below the surface. The world above was muffled, distant, and alien now. Below, everything was chaos, a swirl of bubbles, blood, and violent motion. The shark was dragging her, pulling her deeper into the water. And for the first time in her life, Laura truly felt what it was like to be prey. Her mind raced, alternating between terror and a primal will to survive. She kicked out and flailed her free arm, doing everything she could to dislodge the creature. But it was futile. The shark's strength was overwhelming. With each thrash of its body, it pulled her farther from the surface, from her family, from safety. Above, Michael had turned at the first sign of the disturbance. The sight that greeted him would be burned into his memory forever. His wife, their anchor, was being torn apart by a shark. The water around her turned red, a crimson cloud seeping into the pristine blue. He didn't think. There was no time for that. Every second counted. With a surge of adrenaline that only sheer panic could summon, he lunged toward her, ripping off his snorkel mask and wielding it as a makeshift weapon. He reached Laura just as the shark was beginning another violent shake. Without hesitation, he swung the mask at the shark's head, aiming for its eyes. He struck hard, once, twice, desperate to drive it away. The impact startled the creature enough to make it loosen its grip. It thrashed again, but this time it let go, swimming off into the deep as suddenly as it had appeared, its presence lingering only in the form of the blood it left behind. Laura's body floated limply in the water, her face pale. Michael grabbed her, pulling her up with all his strength. The world around them snapped into horrifying clarity, their children screaming from the boat, the once peaceful ocean now a scene of nightmare. The damage was catastrophic. Laura's arm was shredded, the water pouring off her coated with blood. Her skin hung in jagged strips where the shark's teeth had torn through, exposing muscle and bone. The bite had nearly severed her arm entirely, and the bleeding was immense. Michael pressed his hands to the wound, trying to stem the flow, but blood still seeped through his fingers. The panic in his chest was unbearable, but he had to keep moving. They had to get her to safety. By this time, the ocean lifeguards had been alerted by fellow tourists and had arrived on their boat. With a strength born of desperation, Michael hauled Laura onto the boat instead of taking her to the shore as he tried to keep Sam and Lily away from the gruesome sight. The children's cries filled the air, their faces twisted in shock, their joy from just minutes before obliterated. The boat sped toward the shore, but every minute felt like an eternity. Laura was slipping in and out of consciousness, her body going into shock. Her breathing grew shallow, her skin cold to the touch. Michael kept talking to her, telling her to hold on and stay awake. But her eyes were glazing over, her energy fading with every passing second. By the time they reached the shore, Laura was barely conscious. Medics rushed to her, working frantically to stabilize her as they carried her from the boat to the ambulance. The family's idyllic vacation had turned into a scene of horror. The pristine beaches now tainted by the blood of the mother who had, only moments before, been admiring the beauty of the sea. The hospital was a blur of white walls, harsh lights, and sterile smells. Laura was wheeled into surgery, her fate hanging by a thread. Michael sat in the waiting room, his children huddled close to him, all in shock. The image of the shark, the sound of the water thrashing, the feel of his wife's blood-soaked skin. These things would never leave him. Hours passed, each one heavier than the last. Finally, a doctor appeared, his face grave. Laura had survived, but the damage was severe. She had lost the arm. They had saved her life, but it would never be the same. The ocean was no longer a place of wonder or beauty for Laura and her family. It had shown its true face, unforgiving, wild, and brutal. The magic of the Maldives had been shattered, replaced by a memory that would haunt them forever. The morning had started so peacefully. The sun rose over the Atlantic, casting a golden light that shimmered on the calm waters off the coast of Maine. The Miller family, eager to escape the clamor of everyday life, decided to spend the day kayaking. It was one of their favorite pastimes. The rhythmic strokes of the paddles, the gentle lapping of the waves against their kayaks, and the quiet serenity of the open water were things they treasured. Today, the water seemed incredible still, a vast expanse of blue stretching endlessly before them, bordered only by the distant horizon and the rocky coastline. The family's double kayak cut smoothly through the water. Robert Miller, the father, sat in the back seat, his strong strokes steering them effortlessly along. His wife, Sarah, was in the front, laughing as their teenage daughter, Emily, teased them from her single kayak just a few feet ahead. Emily, an athletic 17-year-old girl, had always been a natural in the water. The family often joked that she must have been a mermaid in another life. They were in sync with each other and the world, a family bonded by love and shared adventures. They had ventured a few miles from shore when the day's peacefulness shattered instantly. Without warning, a tremendous jolt slammed into their kayak. It came so violently that the vessel lurched sideways, knocking Robert and Sarah off balance. The impact was sudden and shocking, a force that could not be mistaken for a mere wave. In the eerie moment that followed, time seemed to slow. A cold, primal fear surged as Robert struggled to process what had happened. His eyes darted to the water, and in the periphery he caught sight of something immense moving beneath the surface. A dark shadow. He knew instantly what it was. A great white shark, enormous and ghostly, had struck their kayak. The kayak began to tip, water rushing into it as the shark's teeth clamped down on the side. The sound of the fiberglass cracking under the immense pressure of the animal's jaws filled the air. Sarah screamed as the kayak capsized, plunging both of them into the frigid water. The shock of the cold hit them like 1,000 needles pricking their skin. Their bodies seized up momentarily as they struggled to keep their heads above the surface. Seeing her parents in distress, Emily tried to maneuver her kayak toward them. But before she could get close, the shark reappeared, its massive dorsal fin slicing through the water toward her with terrifying speed. There was no time to react. In a flash, the shark collided with Emily's kayak, the impact flipping it over. Her scream was brief as she was pulled under the water. Desperation gripped Robert and Sarah. Both fought against the panic in their chests, clawing back onto the now half-submerged kayak. Robert's hands trembled, but he pulled himself up enough to glimpse the chaos. The water around them was no longer calm. It churned violently as the shark circled below. Its presence felt more than seen. Sarah's voice was shrill with terror as she screamed her daughter's name while clinging to the edge of the kayak, scanning the surface for any sign of their daughter. For a moment, Emily broke through the water, gasping for air, her face contorted in panic. She was desperately swimming toward the overturned kayak, but her movements were erratic, arms flailing as the cold water sapped her strength. And then the shark came again. The great white surged up from beneath with its pale underbelly and gaping jaws. It seized Emily by the leg, dragging her back under. The water around her thrashed violently, the surface erupting in a froth of foam and red. Blood spread like ink in water, swirling in the cold Atlantic as the predator's relentless attack continued. Robert could do nothing but watch in helpless horror. His instincts screamed at him to dive in, to save his daughter, but his rational mind held him back. He knew what that would mean, certain death. He grabbed Sarah, pulling her closer as she sobbed uncontrollably, her eyes locked on the spot where Emily had disappeared. The image of her daughter, engulfed by the ocean's depths, was etched into her mind, an inescapable nightmare that had come to life. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. The shark resurfaced again, circling the blood-streaked water. Emily's body broke the surface once more, limp and lifeless, her leg torn to shreds. Her once vibrant, youthful face was pale, her eyes empty as the shark tugged her back under for the final time. The realization that their daughter was gone crashed over Robert and Sarah like a tidal wave. The shock, the disbelief paralyzed them. It was impossible to comprehend the brutality of what had just occurred. Moments ago, they had been laughing, sharing a beautiful day as a family. Now they were adrift in a sea of grief, torn apart by a force of nature that cared nothing for their lives, their love, or their pain. It was too late when the rescue boat arrived, summoned by a passing fisherman who had seen the capsized kayaks in the distance. The boat's crew scanned the water, but there was no sign of Emily. The shark was gone, leaving only the kayak's wreckage and the blood-stained water behind. The aftermath was silent except for the sound of the boat's engine and the soft cries of Sarah, who had collapsed in the arms of one of the rescuers. Robert stared blankly at the horizon, his face as pale as the mist that rolled in from the ocean. The ocean that had once seemed so peaceful, so full of life, had become a graveyard. As they were pulled onto the boat, there was no sense of relief, only an unbearable weight of loss. The rescue crew spoke in hushed tones, offering comfort, but no words could reach Robert and Sarah. They had lost their daughter in the most violent, horrific way imaginable, and no amount of consoling could ease the pain that was now etched into their souls. Oliver had always envisioned the sun-drenched shores of Phuket as a paradise, where worries faded into the horizon and reality transformed into a postcard-perfect experience. The images of powdery white sands and turquoise waters danced in his mind, promising adventure and serenity. As he stood on the beach, the gentle sound of waves crashing against the shore provided a soundtrack to his dreams. His friends lounged nearby, soaking in the sun, but Oliver's adventurous spirit urged him to explore the deeper waters, where the sea glimmered like a jewel beneath the sun's rays. Ignoring the hushed murmurs about recent shark sightings, Oliver felt an irresistible pull toward the enticing sea. He looked back at his friends, who cautioned against venturing too far, their faces twisted in concern. But Oliver dismissed their worries as he waded deeper, the cool water refreshing against his sun-kissed skin. With each stroke, he moved farther from the safety of the shore, buoyed by excitement and the thrill of adventure. The water enveloped him, its buoyancy providing a sense of weightlessness, as if he were flying over the sea's surface. For a brief moment, he felt invincible, free from the constraints of his everyday life. The vast expanse of the ocean stretched before him, inviting and serene. As he swam, he reveled in the beauty surrounding him, unaware of the lurking dangers beneath the shimmering surface. The deeper he ventured, the more the light shifted, casting eerie shadows that danced beneath him. Suddenly, as if summoned by the thrill of his adventure, the tranquil waters exploded into chaos. A shadow moved beneath him, swift and decisive. Oliver's heart raced instantly as he sensed the predatory presence closing in. Before he could react, the water erupted, and he felt an unimaginable force tearing into his side. Pain radiated through him like fire, and instinct took over. He thrashed wildly, fighting against the crushing grip of the black-tipped shark that clamped down on his torso, the sharp teeth slicing through flesh as if it were paper. The world around him blurred into a whirlpool of colors, the turquoise water turning crimson as he screamed, his voice swallowed by the roar of the waves. On the beach, his friends were frozen in horror, their laughter replaced by a chilling realization as they witnessed the unfolding nightmare. Oliver's flailing limbs punctured the surface of the water, splashing violently as he struggled against the force dragging him below. Panic seized them, and they rushed to the water's edge, their hearts pounding in unison. A sense of helplessness washed over them as they screamed his name, their voices carried away by the wind. The beach descended into chaos, a cacophony of alarmed voices echoing. Lifeguards, lounging under the sun just moments before, sprang into action, racing toward the water purposefully. Adrenaline surged through their veins as they plunged into the surf, fighting against the current that pulled them away from the shore. Time seemed to stretch, each second heavy with desperation as they fought to reach Oliver. Their eyes scanned the water, searching for any sign of the friend they had come to cherish, their hearts heavy with dread. As the lifeguards neared the spot where Oliver had been, the water churned violently, a morbid dance of nature at its most brutal. Oliver's screams were a haunting echo that cut through the chaos, a sound that would forever be etched in their minds. The lifeguards' training kicked in as they pushed themselves through the surf, their muscles burning with effort. Every instinct screamed for them to save him, to pull him back from the jaws of death that now held him captive. But as they reached him, the horrifying reality settled in. The black-tip shark had released its grip, but not before inflicting catastrophic damage. Blood clouded the water, a vivid red against the azure blue, and the sight sent a shiver through the lifeguards. They pulled Oliver from the depths, his body limp and battered, the fight for survival flickering in his eyes like a dying ember. The brutal reality of the situation crashed over them as they struggled to keep him afloat, the weight of their helplessness heavy in the water. Back on the beach, a growing crowd gathered, faces drawn with shock and fear. Shouts filled the air, voices blending into a discordant chorus of panic and disbelief. The reality of the shark attack transformed the idyllic setting into a horror scene. Spectators clutched their phones, recording the chaos as though it were a distant event, oblivious to the tragedy unfolding before them. The lifeguards managed to drag Oliver onto the shore, where the beach had morphed into a frenzy of activity. Oliver lay sprawled on the sand, his chest rising and falling in erratic gasps, the life draining from him as his friends knelt beside him, desperation etched on their faces. They could only watch as paramedics arrived, the sirens blaring like a funeral dirge, cutting through the chaos with a stark reminder of the life-and-death struggle unfolding. Despite their frantic efforts, the situation deteriorated. Paramedics worked feverishly, their hands steady despite the gruesome scene. The beautiful beach, once a sanctuary of sun and sea, had transformed into a battleground where life and death clashed. Each passing moment felt like an eternity, intertwined with hope and despair. As they desperately applied pressure to his wounds and attempted to stabilize him, the futility of their actions became painfully apparent. The moment stretched into an agonizing silence, a shared understanding settling over the gathered crowd as they watched Oliver slip away. His once vibrant spirit, filled with dreams of adventure, faded into nothingness as the lifeguards and paramedics continued their futile struggle. The aftermath was a cacophony of anguish and disbelief. The beach that had once welcomed visitors with open arms now stood as a grim reminder of nature's ruthless power. Word spread quickly, casting a shadow over the vibrant paradise. Tourists who had come seeking adventure now huddled together in quiet conversations, their laughter replaced by hushed tones of concern. The beautiful waters of Phuket, once a symbol of paradise, transformed into a haunting memory of loss. Oliver's tragic death became a stark warning, an echo of the dangers that lurked beneath the surface of paradise. The waters that promised joy and serenity now whispered tales of tragedy, forever altering the perception of a destination that had once been a beacon of adventure. His friends, haunted by the images of that fateful day, would carry the weight of their helplessness, their dreams of adventure forever stained by the brutal reality of what lay beneath.